Thanks for joining me on Beyond the Water Cooler. This is where we have the conversations that matter about putting the human factor back into business. Why? Because we know that when we get people right, we get business right. My guests are awesome people who know about all things leadership, engagement, mental well-being and high performance. This is a space to listen, reflect on your own practice and learn how to create an even better experience. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist and psychotherapist and founder of It's Time for Change. Let's dive in. Today is International Day of Happiness. So who better to join me than Matt Phelan, who is co-founder of the Happiness Index. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Lisa.
So you and I both have been speakers at the Alliance of Independent Agencies Happiness or Festival of Happiness a couple of times. As I've heard you speak, and I know you have heaps of interesting stuff on this topic. So I wanted to get you on here to talk about happiness today. I'm curious to know how you came to co-found the Happiness Index.
Okay, so that also links to how I ended up at the Festival of Happiness.
Okay.
Which is I founded and grew and sold a digital and data marketing agency when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
And we founded it because of unhappiness, because as we were scaling, we were getting unhappier employees and we were getting unhappier customers. And we looked at what was out there and there was a lot of engagement stuff, but it didn't really resonate with us. And at that point, I didn't even know what employee engagement was. And then we built this tool, the Happiness Index, internally just to use for our little small independent agency. And then we were working with global brands and the global brands kept saying, oh, can we have that thing that you're using? And we were like, you can't have that because it's rubbish. It's just like a bit of internal tech that we built with Blue Tack. But then eventually more and more people kept asking for it. And eventually we went down the route of founding it as another business. And then we sold the agency and put all our time, effort and money into the Happiness Index because I realized that my skill wasn't my passion. So my skill broadly is sort of like data and brand. Actually, my passion is what makes people tick. And you do cover that in brand because you're thinking about customers. But I was really intrigued in this thing called work that we spend more time with than our families quite often. So yeah, I just got super, super interested in it. And then years and years later, it's International Day of Happiness and I'm getting invited by people like Lisa to talk about it blows my mind that this has happened.
So tell me, Matt, who should be, so people who are just tuning into this episode going, all that happiness stuff, that's not really for me. I'm too important or too senior in my organization. Who should be listening to this episode of the podcast?
Anyone who wants to grow an organization, because you can't grow any organization without growing your people. And that's essentially what this entire subject is about, which is, if you think of I always think the best analogies of your workforce is to think of them like nature, think of them like plants. And if you want those plants to grow, you need to give it the right ingredients. And that's all this is really. Whereas people try and separate out the two and they think that there's this like fluffy thing over here, which is happiness, which belongs at home and isn't important. And then there's this thing over here, like hardcore business metrics. But actually, if you put the two together, they are the same subject. So I'll say something very controversial, which is if you're not aware of this stuff, it's a form of ignorance, which a form of ignorance is actually okay because there's loads of stuff we don't know about and there's still stuff that we haven't learned about as a society. But once you know about it, if you're not making steps to apply some of this stuff, there is a point when you start to think, where does that become incompetence? Because looking after your people is absolutely essential. Like I don't even know what qualifications you need to run a business, even though I've started to. Nobody asked me what my qualifications were. I just signed out like the little thing and you're up and running the business. But I think I'm not saying we should bring in qualifications, but what I am saying, there is a basic understanding of what makes people tick that I think, just like people educate themselves on how the financial P&L works, they should educate themselves on what makes people tick. And one massively brilliant byproduct of that is it will help yourself as well. So running a business where people are thriving is way more fun than running a business where everyone literally hates turning up every day.
Yeah. And that's such a simple key message. I love that bit about ignorance. I used that term last 2 weeks ago when I was talking at a leadership conference around actually you have the choice of whether you remain ignorant or not. And if
Yeah.
you're not, if you're then finding out stuff so that you're fully informed or better informed, you then got a duty, a responsibility to do something with it. So I think it's a
Yeah.
really good point you make. It's so important.
Yeah. There's just so much that we can't know everything in the world. There's so much to know. We are ignorant to so many things, but I think that's our job, isn't it, as leaders, is try and research and look into the things that can make a difference.
Exactly, which is why conversations like this are important. So I came across recently, and only recently because Corporate Rebels published a blog on of some data which is out of date. So I want to relate that to your data, but that suggested that out of 40 activities ranked by happiness, work ranked 39th, just above being sick, which is not, it's not really a very positive finding. And I was thinking, let's discuss that, because although that is not current data, that was back in 2016 or 2017, and you've got live data, it's still being talked about now, which shows it's still relevant now. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is a massive. We didn't plan this, but at least told me 5 minutes ago we we're going to talk about it. But this is the most important question, and I think it goes all the way back to school, and it goes all the way back to childhood around what work is, what we want to be. I did a talk recently on what do you want to be when you grow up, and it's based on an alleged story about John Lennon, and I'll just share it with you, Lisa, for your listeners. So we will talk about research and data, and I haven't been able to nail down whether this story is true, but it's a lovely story, so I'll share it anyway. So John Lennon was at school, and his teacher asked him, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And he said, "When I grow up, I want to be happy." And the teacher said, "Sorry, John, you don't understand the question." And he said, sorry, sir, or sorry, miss, or whatever the reference was, you don't understand life. And there's a whole story in there around, we teach children that work is the bad place that their parents go, that takes them away from themselves, takes them away from them. And the reason I share that John Lennon story is because it makes you think, like, what do you want to be when you get older? Because I know so many people who reach the point that they were working so hard for, and they get there and they realize they're really unhappy. I actually met someone a few years back, only a couple of weeks after the day after they'd retired. They were a medic, and they told me they regretted pretty much every single day of their career.
Oh, wow.
And I just find it so sad. But if we talk about the ignorance and the incompetence thing, if you don't know of certain subjects, you're just ignorant to it. So if your parents have told you, go to medical school, become a medic, that's what you need to do in life, you're just ignorant to the fact that there's other ways and other things that you could have done. It's not your fault. But if you start to look if we just stay in the world of medical for a second, and I think Lisa shared this at the Festival of Happiness, if you go into two hospitals and the two hospitals are exactly the same, the one hospital with the unhappier staff has a higher mortality rate. So that study is done by Professor Jeremy Dawson, which is the largest study ever done on one workforce, which is over 1 million employees in the NHS at the time. So generally, when people like Corporate Rebels, they're talking generally about corporate environments like lawyers and agencies and all this kind of stuff. But there's a whole world of work out there that isn't sitting at a desk. So to answer your question, I think it has to go right back to children and the way we organize education and the way we organize work. And I spend a lot of time bringing my children to work, taking them to things. I don't want them to grow up thinking, oh, that's the worst bit. That's the worst bit of your career. And I will go on the worst bit of your life. That's what people say to kids all the time. Oh, you don't know how lucky you are. These are the best days of your life. They shouldn't be. There should be great days, and then there should be great days in the future as well. So I will touch on some life satisfaction research in a second. But does that answer your question, Lisa?
Yeah, it does. I think it's really interesting, that whole going back to childhood bit and what they understand as happiness and what they think about as in terms of their future. Because I'm also really aware, and I was having a conversation with a friend recently who we're talking about how many young people we know now who are pushed like to the limit of filling their time with activities which are about stretching them and uh, about attaining high things and being the best you can be at all these different areas in life, to the point where it almost feels like they are so overwhelmed with being on and doing all these activities that are supposed to, it reflects you've got a really happy life and you're
Yep.
so um you're lucky to be able to access all these lovely opportunities.
Yeah.
And I wonder whose needs that is actually fulfilling, whether it's their parents' need, who thinks this
Yep.
is what success looks like and status and attainment and everything that they need for the future, and actually being able to have some off time where you just, I don't know, as a kid, you just jump on your bike, head off into the village or a field, or just call on a mate and just
Yeah.
you're allowed to be bored and you're allowed to kind of just do what comes to mind that naturally makes you happy rather than it
Yeah.
being led by someone else.
Yeah, it's so true, and I think there is a change in society and what people deem safe and where their children could go and play. Because I'm a girls football coach, so I coach girls aged about 10 to 11,
Mm.
and it's incredible how far girls and women's football has come. Is brilliant, massive advocate from it. But one of the biggest challenges is the amount of time the girls play football and can train, because there's one thing, they have less access to resources than boys. That's a fact. I'm on the front line, I see that every single day. However, less parents are less likely to let their children just go to the park for 4 or 5 hours and say come back when it's dark.
Yeah.
So the girls in our group of teams probably play 4 or 5 hours of football a week. When I was a child, I could easily play 4 or 5 hours a day,
Mm.
just with my brothers and sisters outside. So I think there's a
Mm.
society's change as well around like what we trust. And if this does link to some of the research, the World Happiness Report will be landing very, very soon, and they often cite some of the Nordic countries. And there's a really good UK journalist, Helen Russell, who's just spent 10 years living out there, and
Okay.
she's written a book called How to Raise a Viking. It's a really good parenting book, and she talks about a lot of the things that they have from a cultural perspective. And she just did a review coming back. If you Google it, you'll be able to find it. And two of the things that she wrote sort of 10 things that they have in Danish culture. And one of those she wrote about is that they let their babies be outside on their own in a pram. Now, if you did that in the UK, I did that accidentally once when my daughter was in a pram, because I went to do a workout in the park and I was just doing like running around the pram. And
Mm.
but I was never that far away from the pram, and someone immediately ran up and, oh my God, there's a baby. I was like, no, it's my baby. I'm just doing a workout
Yeah.
whilst I'm here. But that's, if you said that to someone in the UK, that's their worst nightmare. Parents should not abandon their children. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong here, but that's one of the things that she wrote around that like element of they're not as scared to allow their children right from babies through to be on their own, which I know as a parent, I am the most scared, paranoid parent out there. I'm constantly on high alert. But I think there's a cultural element to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. So what would you recommend we think about now in terms of the what your research is showing, or because your research is super relevant, it's timely, it's like it's daily, is that right?
Well, we're collecting data every second,
Okay.
and then we're analysing that data on a regular basis. So in June, we've got our workplace happiness event, and we'll release it there. But it shows up new and interesting things in every country and every day. And there's just, I always say we've probably got more understanding than most people about the workplace happiness in the world, but we're still uncovering new stuff. And I still reckon we're only at 1% of the understanding. I think we still got a long way to go. And even that article that you referenced, you sent back to me, was 2016, 2017. I was reading that thinking how much we've learned since then as well, and how much has changed. And we've had a pandemic in the middle of that as well.
Yeah. So what would be, in terms of what you find, what are the kind of main barriers to happiness now? Do you have a sense of, because this report before was talking about, if people are having to go into work, they're unhappier. If they're having to work evenings or weekends, they're unhappier, and so on. What sort of trends are you finding? Are you seeing?
So I think there are certain things that we share and there are certain things that are different. And I think that's the skill of leadership, to work out what are the things that we all need that are
Mm,
similar,
mm,
but then the management. So leadership is about understanding the big trends that people need.
mm,
And then management, if you're a manager of someone, you should know the specifics of that individual, because that's what's important to them. So if you were employing me, I do the school run every single day. If my job didn't allow me to do that, I'd be deeply unhappy and I wouldn't work there.
yeah.
So I feel like I have a unique set of skills that's useful for the job marketplace. And if someone was looking to recruit me and someone offered me that and someone didn't, then I can't go and work there. So there's that. Let's go into the macro and the micro. So the number one driver of happiness that we see in our data set and maps out on a lot of other studies is relationships.
Mm,
And this is where I think a lot of miscommunication around the return to work and office has lent on this, because you read about it. And I want to park the people that are telling their employees to return to the office because really they want them to resign. That is happening. There is a proportion of those, and that is purely companies realizing it's cheaper to get people to resign than it is to make them redundant or whatever it is in that country. So I'm going to park those companies because that's another story, another conversation for another day, for that we could spend about a year on, Lisa, on the ethics of that. However, if we just assume positive intent for a second from lots of leaders, they are saying, well, we need to go back to the office because they are quoting some of the stuff. They're saying relationships, collaboration, how you feel, all this kind of stuff. That I think what's missing, and it's around the word behind you, Lisa, change, which is change has happened. And what we know from our neuroscientists here at the Happiness Index is when you're under pressure, you go back to what you know.
yeah.
It's like we all do it. And if you think most leaders in most organizations, the majority of their career was running a business in an office, not running a business either virtual or hybrid. So they know that environment, they know how to do that. However, expectations of employees have changed. And the thing that I always think is when people say, oh, yeah, it's really good to make people gel in the office. The thing that I always think is that there are many cases, and I'm sitting in an office now, where an office is really useful. But if you applied that to the rest of your life, you wouldn't get married in an office. You wouldn't have a party in an office. You would never choose. You wouldn't choose that that's the place you go. There's no like hen do's and stag do's all like lining up to book offices and hang out there to get that feeling together. So I think offices do have a strong purpose in the future, but to sit at your laptop, that just doesn't make sense. But there's still ways that locations can bring people together to collaborate. So I think relationships comes out number one. I think the other one that I want to share that's in the top 4 is acknowledgement. What's interesting about acknowledgement is acknowledgement has the highest standard deviation of all of the factors in the top 8. And what that means is if I'm just going to imagine there's 4 people on this call. So there's Lisa, there's Lloyd, and there's Matt, and there's Phelan. And these 4 individuals, they what they want from relationships, whether they're introverts or extroverts, is quite similar. Sometimes this conversation gets mixed up between introverts and extroverts. We all need what relationships give us. We just may seek them in different ways, but we still have the same needs from it. When it comes to acknowledgement, the way that we want to acknowledge is highly different. So even go back to like coaching my girls team, I know for a fact that there are 2 girls that don't like me to say well done. I just thought that's a good thing. But if I say to my daughter, which she scored a goal the other day. I said, well done. She hates it. Like, it's the worst thing. There's a dad element in there as well.
Yeah.
But there is a coaching element, because it is not just her that's like that. And there are some that think that I don't say well done enough.
Yeah.
So that's where management comes in. That's where you've got to understand, like, your team players, the people that are in your team, how do they want to be acknowledged? The one that I always share as my biggest mistake is our CTO did a really good upgrade to our platform, and led that project. It was fundamentally transformational for the happiness index. And I gave him a shout out at the company update, and he hated it. Absolutely hated it. And I've worked with him for 15 years. I know that he would have hated it. What I should have done is gone for a coffee with him and just said, no, I appreciate what you did there. So I would say those two, and then a wraparound summary point on all of this, which is going back to the leaders that are listening. Everything that drives our happiness at work wasn't invented in the last 2,000 years. So technology has a huge part to play. I run a technology company, but the things that make us tick as human beings, they're not new. They've been there. Look at what the other one in the top 4, psychological safety. That's not new. That's not something that psychologists invented. That is a description of something that we need. We've always needed it. We've needed it for 10,000 years, but we now have a label for it to go, right, okay, if people don't feel safe, they're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. I can't even say the word freeze mode. If someone's in fight, flight, or freeze, they're not accessing, for example, the creative parts of their brain, because all of their resources are there to survive. We don't want our employees being like that, but many leaders lead that way. You see it all the time, don't you? Like phrases like, "Oh, we need to keep people on their toes." Do you really need to keep people on their toes, or do you need to give people clarity on what the plan is and make sure that they've got the resources to deliver it?
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? That whole this stuff isn't new. I talk a lot about kind of basic human emotional needs, and the needs being, you talked about relationships, so having that sense of connection with people, acknowledgement, but the feeling right, and that sense of kind of control around how we do things and not being kind of micromanaged and so on. And I think what you're highlighting just kind of goes back to the need for, if you're looking at manager level, for managers to really know their people. And that's the bit I think a lot of managers don't necessarily do well enough, because they don't understand, going back to this ignorance bit, they don't understand the importance of that. And their role isn't developed in a way that they are given time to go and develop relationships, because it's almost seen as that's not real management. Real management is kind of task focused, rather than being in that kind of bit more ambiguous space, which is about developing relationships and getting to know people and spending time and feeding back and all this kind of the soft skills stuff and creating that psychological safety. And that's the stuff that hasn't been, isn't necessarily valued enough, or hasn't been valued enough for it to be developed well enough. And I think now people are beginning to put stuff on the table going, well, we know we should be doing something with this. So they're now more aware of it, but still not necessarily feeling skilled enough or confident enough to do again what's necessary, what's needed of them.
Absolutely. And I think that whole world of work made this kind of like assumption that we're robots. And they're robots. And if that robot doesn't work, you get another robot in. But again, this is where I think technology has been a positive. Things like WhatsApp, things like LinkedIn, things like Glassdoor, is you can't just decide tomorrow to go and work somewhere else in the world. There are obviously travel restrictions, all this kind of stuff, but 4 people in one organization can decide tomorrow to quit and start their own business. Like the ability to do that and find other people around the world that are similar to you and work on that, the power has shifted. And I think some companies are really struggling with that, because I think they're trying to re-exert the power. But the problem with that is, if you think of the whole workforce as the talent pool, the best people are going to have the choice. So you're missing out. You're missing out on talent. I mean, I was talking to someone on the school run, like the amount of, and there's been some good work done in the last few years on this, but when you think how working mums in the workforce get treated, it's absolutely criminal. And you think how much resource, like I was talking to my friend Nadine on the school run, like how you could set up a documentary of setting up a business just with the talent that you meet on a school run that are not doing their main skill thing, because there isn't a company that will accommodate some of the things that they want to do around that. And we talk about it all the time. Like, it's just ridiculous. Like the amount of lost talent that is sitting there just because of some stuff that what talking to some of the working mums at our school, they're not asking for ridiculous things. They're asking for like flexi time and things like that. Like it's just lost talent.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So what's some of the barriers then in terms of people's happiness at work and being able to fulfill that? Because I'm just thinking, like, you've just highlighted one by saying actually people's kind of rigid thinking around this is what we expect of our workforce, and we expect them to deliver that. If they can't work those hours, go back to your working mums example, then we're not interested. And of course, it's actually potentially it's not a barrier to that working mum's happiness, because she'll go somewhere else and find somewhere that she can be happy. But what are some of the barriers that you're seeing? What are employers getting wrong?
I think there's probably 3 or 4 things. I think the first thing is permission, and I can give anyone listening permission now, which is you can't make anyone else happy. So that's like the first thing. People go, well, we can't. We look, and this is the permission. You can't make your wife happy. You can't make your husband happy. You can't make your sister happy. You can't make your brother happy. You can't make your employees happy. You can't make your children happy. That's the first thing to remove. And then
I can almost sense a sigh of relief coming from people. I go, oh, thank goodness.
Good. Okay, so you now have permission to go. Okay, and then, but what happens is some people go, well, there's no point bothering then, is there? So it's like, well, if I can't make my employees happy, it's not my responsibility. So that's where I think the sweet spot is, which is, and go back to the plant thing. You can't make someone happy, but you can create the right conditions for them to be happy. And that's all you can do. That's all you can do for your children. That's all you can do for your employee workforce. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And also, you will get people, if you create the right environment, you'll get people still that are unhappy in that environment. But again, if you go back to like the gardener or farmer exercise, if you create this amazing garden and all these different types of flowers are all thriving there is 1 or 2 that won't. But it doesn't mean you stop doing all that great thing you're doing, like making sure they've got the right light, making sure they've got the right ingredients, like making sure there's the right soil. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And then the next 3 or 4 challenges that come up. So firstly, if people decide they want to do it, like there's no point on this unless the leaders really want to do it. It becomes, employees are smart. They know if you're just doing it because it's tick box. So you've got to get people behind it. The second thing that happens is we see at the happiness index when someone gets their data back, is people want to not admit the truth. And I always think of that Tom Cruise movie where he's like, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth. Jack Nicklaus. That's what it's like in corporate businesses every single day. You get the information back, and there isn't a culture out there that doesn't have problems. Every single organization there, including the happiness index, will have cultural issues. It's just fact. There isn't a perfect culture. So there will be issues. And at that point, you basically have to decide, are you going to lean into them and try and do something about it? Or there's a natural instinct in people to lessen it or pretend it's not happening or say it's just a few people. And it even happened as a football coach. I saw it happen with one of our players left because we wouldn't have had the language of this 20 years ago, but she left because she didn't feel like she was included. We now know about belonging and inclusion, but that's anyone without that label knows what it's like your first day at school and you haven't got any friends. It's just that feeling. Think of that feeling and then apply it to the workforce. You're not going to be yourself. So the first thing with CEOs is sometimes, sadly, they get worried that if they tell people that the data's bad, that it's going to be a bad thing. And that's where relationships have to come in, because we're presenting data like this all the time, and you have to politely say the problem is the only person who didn't know this was you. Actually, they already know because they told you. So the only person who didn't know is you, and you don't, obviously I wouldn't say it this sarcastically, the only person who didn't know is you. So you need to give that person who's getting that new information time to process that information and get used to it, because it's like any of us. If you give us some bad news, like, oh God, it's a shock. And if we want to be really kind to CEOs, unfortunately, no matter how chilled out you think you are, an open door policy you've got, you there's a power dynamic in your organization where information will get filtered through to you.
Mm.
So every CEO that's listening, and I include myself in this, you don't know what the culture is like in your organization. I'm really sorry to share that.
Yeah.
But there is a power dynamic. You have the power over whether someone can pay their rent or mortgage in a few months' time. That's the reality of it. It sits there. We can pretend it doesn't, but it does. So when you go around asking for feedback, it's coming through a filter. So the first bit is giving people permission. The second bit is around once the data comes back, not to lessen it or ignore it or take it with a pinch of salt. The third one is again, it's a permission thing. You can't fix everything.
Yeah.
You can't fix everything in the culture. And also what I always say I always ask this question, which is, I hope I get the right answer to it, but I always say, are you breaking child labor laws in your organization? And then hopefully they say no. Otherwise we wouldn't want to be working with them. But they'll say no. And then you then, a really simple conversation, which is every problem in your data, your employees are currently dealing with in their personal life. Can they afford this? Can they afford that? What does the budget look like? Mental health issues, health issues, all of the things that you'll see in the data are not special CEO things that you're dealing with. They're all things that people are dealing with already. Budgets, mental health, well-being, resources. They're all things like, can we afford for Nan to go into that home? All of these things are probably even more serious in someone's personal life. So the things that you'll see in data around, like someone doesn't feel like they're included, we don't have enough money to do this thing, or I want pay rises because I need to do this. Your employees will understand those subjects if you speak to them. However, if you ignore them and pretend they're not there, it does the opposite. People get unhappier.
Yeah.
But the final point on that is people will also understand when you can't do stuff. But they don't want you to fix everything because they know you can't. But if you stand up in front of them and say, these are the 10 things you fed back to us, I'm going to focus on 2 this year. I can't actually control the other 8 at the moment for these reasons. What's wonderful, Lisa, I've talked quite negative so far. You can see that positive energy just bloom in an organization. Once you get that CEO to stop thinking I've got to be perfect and have all the answers, and just to say, I hear you. These are things we can work on. These are things we can't. It's incredible to watch, Lisa, like when you see it happen, and it's just brilliant. It's just a good reminder all the time when you're going through that curve. It's a bit like going through a movie. You think, oh God, it's not going to work. They're never going to get together. And then eventually it all starts to come together. And then the CEOs, they've switched around by then. Then they become recommenders, and they're like, oh my God. And they've normally forgotten they were worried at the beginning themselves.
Yeah. I think it's such a good point, but I think that takes certain degree of vulnerability, that kind of being honest and being very transparent about the data, and but that open communication I love around, we don't know what necessarily all the answers are, we don't know, we've got this bit of a problem, we don't know how to solve it, but we are looking at it, we are going to address it, or we're going to have conversations, just letting people know that it's being registered and that it is on the table, even if we can't solve it right now. So I think that's super, super important. What I'm curious to know is, again, because I've had conversations recently with people who are quite senior in their organization, and they really get this stuff. They're like, we need to develop our leaders and develop our managers and create more space to develop things like psychological safety and relationships and so on. But there are some directors on the board, or all of them, or some of them, who are just really resistant to looking at this and to taking this on board. What would be your advice to those people who are really behind it and know the importance of it, for them to try and move this agenda forward in their organization?
This is the hardest question I get asked.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm going to just give the most honest answer I can, which is, I've been doing this for about 10 years. And if I lined up all the CEOs that I've met and the boards, I would say 1/3 of them intuitively understand this subject, and they'll be having a conversation like you and I, Lisa. One third, if you show them the data and make the business case, they will get on board it and go, oh no, this is just like they would a digital marketing campaign. If you showed them the data and said, well, if we do this, it means we're going to get this return. I still think there is about 1/3 out there that won't change. And I know that's a really negative thing to share on such a day.
No, but I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that puts it puts me and it's not a problem for me because our brand filters out those companies. They don't come to us in the first place. I'm not dealing with these people, but I meet them in my normal life. And I think it does put employees in a difficult position. And in my inbox, I'm not an agony aunt, but if I revealed my LinkedIn inbox, it's not actually people messaging me saying, can I become a customer review employee engagement platform, which it sometimes is. It's mainly long messages about this subject, about someone, oh yeah, no, I've read your book, Matt, or I've read someone else's book, or I've read that paper that Lisa shared on LinkedIn. And this aligns with me. But I'm working for someone who doesn't give a damn or whatever. And then and honestly, some of them are like War and Peace. And I feel quite sad because I feel like they're messaging someone they don't actually know.
Yeah.
And if you are, do message me because I will reply. But I feel sad for them because the honest answer is they probably do need to move. And this is the worst thing about it is I think customer service is like, bad customer service is like a slap in the face. You experience that slap in the face, you feel the pain, and you don't go back to where that slap came from, generally speaking. So if you go into a restaurant and the food's bad, you just don't go back.
No, exactly.
But when it's a culture where you work and you've got all these other things like your bills and stuff to pay, the bad culture is like a cancer that kills an organization over time. So sometimes that leader can be there in situ for a long period of time, and it's sort of not coming out that person's a problem. So there are scenarios where people do have to leave the organization they're in. But I think that goes back right to the beginning of the conversation is this is generating the flow of the best people into organizations that ultimately are going to perform, because those people, although that's going to be painful for them, they're going to be really talented people that are going to go somewhere. And when they get somewhere, they're going to really appreciate where they work, and that company's going to benefit from it. So I've just been honest. I hate to say this because I don't like giving up, but I do think there are sort of organizations that will never get it.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree more. And my advice to some people is, if you can't change it where you are and you've tried lots of different avenues, at the end of the day, you are someone who's got lots to give. You're passionate about getting the stuff right. And so go and find somewhere that is behind you.
Yeah. But I think my son officially ended, as far as I'm concerned, at the weekend, the digital transformation era. And I'll tell you how he did it by accident, but he started to child-splain to me what a bookshop is. So he said he'd been into a bookshop thing at school, and he said, Dad, yeah, we did this bookshop thing. It's like, he said, he goes, the only way I can explain it to you is it's like going into an Amazon and going into the Amazon. He was talking about it like it was,
yeah.
It's like you go into the Amazon, but they won't send you the books. You got to get them while you're there. And they won't send them to your home. And the reason I think there's a lot of parallels here with digital transformation is, and I feel like my son ended it this weekend because I've been around in different versions of digital transformation with that comment, is that all of these things go in massive cycles. Like I remember people saying like people will never shop online. People, and then it was, people are not going to buy stuff on a mobile. Like, and when you say that to people, they like, well, it's like, oh yeah, it was inevitable. But it didn't feel inevitable at the time because, and I was meeting loads of people and loads of brands at that period of time that didn't invest in digital transformation. Their organizations don't exist anymore. We worked in the early days with people like Gymshark who got it from the beginning, and then they replaced those organizations. So although these things take time, they will play out. And to me, it was obvious. But I after I finished at my marketing agency, I did an analysis of my time, my 10-year period, And I calculated that I wasted 10 years of my life. Sorry, out of my 10 years, I calculated I wasted 5 years of my life trying to get organizations to transform that weren't ready to transform. And I feel like there is an element of this in cultural transformation at the moment, and there are big back pushes. Like there's some pretty horrific stuff going on in America at the moment, and I don't even want to get into that today, but I think it's like a flow. It goes back and forth. But I think ultimately we're getting to the point where the employees have the choice, and you need to be the employer of choice. Otherwise, you're not going to get the best people.
Yeah. There's so much I'd love to go into with you today, Matt, but I'm already aware of time because you're on a tight schedule. So in terms of today being International Day of Happiness, what is your thought around that being a good thing or not a good thing in terms of having this day?
Okay, I'm gonna use Valentine's Day as an example of how much I've grown as an individual. I used to hate Valentine's Day. I used to think I used to subscribe into all the people that say, "Oh, it's just manufactured by card companies, blah blah blah," all the reasons. And I was one of those. I was like a right Grinch about it. And I used to be like that by my own birthday as well. Like I used to hate my birthday. But then I think this is an age thing, and you just think, well, there's just take advantage of it and have some fun. Like it's not a problem. So I now think that I used to think a little bit about International Day of Happiness, like, oh, it should be happy every day. And like, oh, you should cook your partner dinner every day, and every day should be a birthday, blah, blah, blah. But life's not like that. Life is busy. I think these days are a great moment to reflect. And my one thing that I would ask on reflection, anyone listening, ask your friends or family or colleagues, just ask them. And we're going to do this on Lisa. Just ask them what makes you happy. And you'll just know that person a little bit more. You might get a generic first off, but then you can dig a little bit deeper. So Lisa, what makes you happy?
Makes me happy is spending time with my family and time outdoors are the two things.
There you go. So they're absolute classics. But if you're working with Lisa and you know you're restricting the time that she's got with her family, and also like I'm a big fan of a walking meeting. So if we're working together, we've just been on this Zoom thing for an hour. If you were in the office over there and I were here and we had a meeting next, let's go for a walk. I'm near the Barbican. There's amazing like water features and stuff around there. We could go and have a little walk.
Yeah, no, I love that. So what would be your key takeaways that you'd want people, particularly leaders and managers who are listening to this, to take away from this conversation today?
I would stop trying to separate everything out, like culture and brand and marketing and advertising, and go back to what you said, Lisa, which is we all have these emotional needs, and it's about how we meet them. It doesn't matter whether it's your customers or your employees. They are needs, and it's very good business sense to try and understand them. So I would start with the activity that Lisa and I just did on a one-on-one, but start thinking about your teams, like what needs do they have, and just think if you don't fulfill those needs, then someone else may.
Yeah, I love that. You've touched on so many things. There's loads more I could talk to you about, but we're out of time. So I'm going to wrap that up now in terms of, you've mentioned your book. Obviously there is the happiness index. We're going to put all your details in the show notes so people can reach out to you and connect with you on LinkedIn and so on. Are there any, in terms of people who are thinking, okay, I need to take this stuff seriously, what would be the first steps? So obviously asking people that question. Is there anything else that you think people should start to try and think about in terms of engaging with this and making a difference?
Just start reading yourself. Like I didn't plan to get into this subject, but one little read to the next TEDx, the next YouTube. But there are so many people like myself that just started on the journey by reading one little book or one YouTube. And I'll give everyone a lovely coffee side table book, which is, it's nothing really to do with data and research, but it's called The Little Book of Hygge. And it's about, so it's spelled Hygge, so like Hygge. It's written by a friend of mine he's got the best Danish name ever. He's called Mike Viking. That's his actual name.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's spelled with a W, and then it's Mike is MEIK.
Okay.
Just start with that. Even if you don't like the book, it looks beautiful and it's got an amazing cover. But that was one of the books when I was trying to work out what I was going to do in my next stage. I read that, and it confirmed some stuff in my head. But you don't really realize you're really reading something, because Mike runs the Research Institute for Happiness in Copenhagen. But this is a book about Danish culture, which it might unlock a few little thoughts like it did for me.
Love it. That's so good. Matt, thank you so much for your time today, because I know you're super busy. So I'm really grateful for you fitting this in. There's so much more you could talk about. I know you could talk for hours and hours on this subject. So I recommend that people get in touch with you and find out more. But thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
What have you taken from that conversation to think about or do differently? How has that inspired you to develop practice to bring out the best in people, including yourself? This podcast gets more listeners when people like you give a thumbs up on Apple or wherever you listen, and especially if you leave a short review. So please help be part of the movement towards creating workplaces that really provide the best experience for their people. And do reach out to me directly to discuss your challenges at work and ideas for development. If we're not already acquainted on LinkedIn, let's connect. All the links you need are in the show notes. And if you join the club, you'll be the first to hear about relevant updates and free downloadable resources that are part of developing practice and performance. Thanks for joining me today.